Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor Beatriz Luna, who is Professor of Psychiatry and Pediatrics and Professor of Psychology at the University of Pittsburgh. She's the founder and director of the Laboratory for Neurocognitive Development, the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience, and the founder and president of the Flux Society for Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience. Welcome, Bea.
Welcome. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I want to start with your review article from 2015 to set the context for our conversation, an integrative model of the maturation of cognitive control, in which you say the brain systems undergo unique and specific dynamic changes at the cellular circuit and systems level that underlie the transition to adult-level cognitive control. You say we integrate literature from the different levels of analysis to propose a novel model of the brain basis of the development of cognitive control. So before we get into the details of this, Bea, so what exactly do you mean by cognitive control?
Oh, that's right. So as humans, but also animals, our behavior is either determined, as a reaction to stimuli, or it is actually planned and goal-driven. And that is, and it engages cognitive control so that we're not distracted and that we continue with our goal-driven plan. And it uses working memory, it uses inhibitory control, flexibility, attention, etc.
Okay. And so this is a very important aspect of the brain, isn't it? It's mind-boggling to really think about sort of the development of the brain. It's the most powerful one. Most people think it's a quantum computer, but the most powerful machine that we know. But it has to grow, right? It has to grow from something very simple to something extremely complex. And nature seems to have figured out how to do it.
No, yeah, absolutely. And it's all very intentional and occurring. The slow development is adaptive.
Yeah.
Humans.
Yeah. And so if we take so if we kind of look back at animal brains and how we evolved, do we see a lot of similarities there?
Well, what characterizes the human brain is the fact that the prefrontal cortex is proportional to the rest of the brain, has a greater proportion than other mammals. And, the prefrontal cortex is a primary area for cognitive control, not because it is, in fact, the area that is doing the actual mechanics of cognitive control, but because it coordinates a widely distributed circuitry that allows for the flexible and reliable engagement of cognitive control.
Yeah, so this sort of distributed decision making and the circuitry, so that the more complex the brain is, in some sense, it has a higher likelihood of I don't know what the right term is, going haywire.
Well, it's interesting that across mental illnesses,
Yeah,
one feature that always arises is limitations in cognitive control. Not that it characterizes the disorder, but in all of these tests of working memory, inhibitory control, attention, etc., people with schizophrenia, autism, mood disorders, depression, they all show a decrease in their cognitive control ability, which is really reflecting that cognitive control is engaging such a dynamic distributed circuitry that it is a way to probe the integrity of brain circuitry, which would be disrupted in mental illness.
Yeah. So do you think of cognitive control as sort of an outcome, or sort of the mechanistic process that goes on?
That's interesting. I guess a little bit of both.
Yeah.
There are, both aspects of it, speak to cognitive control.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about, so we have this issue as humans develop from childhood to adulthood. We go through a period of chaos, so to speak. I don't know how to describe it. All of us have done that. During which time the brain is doing a lot of different things, right? It's a very complex process that we all go through, but it has some downsides, so to speak.
Well, the way that we've been looking at what we call neurocognitive development is that initially, from birth through childhood, there is a process of accumulation. The brain is actually getting bigger. We are learning to walk, we're learning to talk, cognitive processes are coming online. But by adolescence, everything is already there. And then there is a shift to specialization in a Hebbian process of use it or lose it.
Yeah.
And we propose that this is a very important period of development, adolescence, when adult trajectories are going to be established.
Yeah. So the adolescent brain is on a track to adulthood, but it seems like there are a lot of uncertainties, right, to reach that sort of the mature brain.
Is your question, how do we determine maturity?
No, I'm just wondering. So let me sort of backtrack a little bit. So, if I understand this correctly, I have no understanding of the brain. It seems like during that phase of the brain growing from the child's brain to the adult's brain, there are a lot of uncertainties, right, in the brain structure, composition, progression. Is that what we find?
Yeah, I mean, there are already predetermined mechanisms, right? So, for example, there is synaptogenesis, an increase in the number of synaptic connections between neurons, right? And that occurs early, from birth, they increase and they increase until mid-childhood, where now they start to decrease. And they continue to decrease, for example, in prefrontal cortex until you're 30 years of age. And that's just a basic mechanism that is determined early on. However, we are all born with a genetic neurobiological predisposition in a particular environment. And that initial stage of development is very much about discovering the adaptive fit position to the environment. And, the brain is just trying to fit that piece together. And it could turn out to be within normal range, or it could end up being, for example, a non-normative range trajectory, such as in mental illness.
Yeah. So I want to bring another paper of yours from 2016 into this conversation. Adolescent Brain Development Implications for the Juvenile Criminal Justice System, in which you say recent U.S. Supreme Court opinions regarding extended sentencing for juveniles have made reference to their immaturity on the basis of what any parent knows, and to evidence from psychology and brain science indicating differences in brain processes underlying control of behavior, making juveniles more vulnerable to impulsivity and risk-taking. Now, most parents know or seen this process of kids growing up, and so what are the? This is from 2016. I know there were a couple of Supreme Court cases around this of crime and other things. So what's the latest thinking around this from a scientific perspective there?
So there are a few points that need to be clarified. When we think of adolescence, we know it is a time of peak sensation seeking. And this is something that is seen across species and across cultures. It's normative. But the sensation seeking can lead to risk-taking behavior, including delinquency. But this is all within the realms of what the brain is capable of doing. And we very much believe that this peak in sensation seeking is necessary for the brain to gain the experiences, new independent experiences, in order to sculpt itself to its most optimal, model that it can. Yeah. So when it comes to the juvenile justice system, and note that these were cases that had to do with the length of punishment, so life without parole. Yeah. And so some issues were evident. I had to think about this a lot because we have to be very careful about the limited amount that we can inform ethical questions such as juvenile justice. And there were some things that we thought that we could actually inform. And the way that we look at adolescence is the following. So across the field, it is understood that adolescence is a time where motivational, emotion, and reward processing are predominating over cognitive executive processes. Now, different models suggest, and you see it very much in the media, that adolescence is a time when prefrontal cortex is not quite online. That is not what we're finding. We do find that there's elevation, hyper, responsivity to motivational situations, but what we find is that actually adolescence is a time when you have access to adult level executive function. It is not stable. It is a new ability that has come to the fore that needs to be strengthened and stabilized. But what occurs then is that you have this very articulate new system that is being pushed or driven by this, increase in excitability for motivational cues. And in fact, our model is called the driven dual systems model. So when it comes to the juvenile justice, we think that we can inform, number one, culpability. So to make it really short, that the crime was committed, quote, under adolescence. right? So meaning that it was committed at a time when the brain is particularly driven by motivation, driving this really amazing capacity to plan. Because, you know, when you look at these crimes, they're very well planned. If you think of Columbine, that was, you cannot say there was not executive, you know, adult level executive function involved in that planning, but it was done with heightened motivation, and peers also plays a very big role. In fact, the majority of juvenile crime is committed in the presence of peers. So that's one aspect of juvenile justice that is informed. The other aspect that is very crucial, and I find myself repeating this to judges. I went to also to the U.S. Supreme Court in Uruguay, where they were trying to change the age of culpability, to decrease it to 16 years of age. That did not happen. You know, but I had to address them as well. And, you know, one of the big points is that adolescence is a very short period of development, right? Just a few years.
Yeah.
And know who that individual is going to be. We do not know if that act was an act of adolescence or if that was an act that really characterizes that individual. In fact, NPR interviewed me regarding the Kavanaugh experience, and all that I could say with that is, yes, you know, in adolescence you might do things that were part of adolescence. How do we know that that was only an adolescent action and not who you are as an adult? In my opinion, is that if you are able to recognize retrospectively that what you did back then, you know, to acknowledge it and to realize that it was wrong, then it gives you some evidence that you are not that sort of an individual. And then the third point that is applicable to the juvenile justice is that because of the significant plasticity that is occurring during the adolescent period, that their adolescents may be more amenable to rehabilitation than adults. So those 3 points speak particularly to the length of sentencing. So when you're talking about life without parole, when someone committed a crime at 14, it seems that we don't really know. That individual at 25 or 30 might be a completely different individual, and that is often seen, which is the case. Then again, there are some that are not, that are actual psychopaths and will continue to behave in that manner.
Yeah. This is so interesting, Bea, you know, without knowing a lot about it. So when we think about artificial intelligence, for example, we have deep learning neural networks, we have to train them. And training requires labeled cases. The proxy for humans really are, you know, experiences. And so I want to get your perspective on evolution in just a minute. It seems to me that nature has came up with a design that has a lot of flexibility in a short period of time, let's say 5 years, during which the individual is collecting labeled cases in artificial intelligence jargon to actually learn more and more so that the brain can mature into something that's much more usable. So if that's the case, and if it is really kind of systematically predictable, you know, when a human being would have this phase, let's say 4 or 5 years, can we actually intervene in? I'm thinking therapeutic intervention here. Is there a therapeutic intervention to adolescents?
Well, I think that is what we want to know, and theoretically, yes, because what's occurring, and we actually have a paper on critical period plasticity, and critical period plasticity comes about when you've reached a level in a part of the brain where information is coming in that has such high signal that there has to be reorganization of the cytoarchitecture to be able to change it, right? To be able to adapt and be able to process that information. So for example, in the visual system, you're born, you open your eyes, all this visual stimuli comes in, it increases excitation compared to inhibitory processes, and then the cytoarchitecture of the visual cortex is rearranged so that now it can more effectively process that information. Now, what we have found in the literature is evidence that this might be occurring in prefrontal cortex and perhaps in other association cortices, where by the time that you reach adolescence, the fidelity of the sensory systems, which have now matured, are bringing such high signal information from many different regions that these association cortices have to actually reorganize at that time. So if you're talking about the effectiveness of intervention, theoretically, yes, this would be a good time. And then what happens is that from adolescence to adulthood, you see what we call closing mechanisms of critical period. Not that it closes completely. We know the plasticity is available throughout the lifespan, but it is reduced because you want stability in the system. So you have things like myelination, which is the insulating of the white matter tracts in the brain that, yes, they speed up neural information processing, but they also, establish that circuitry is going to be cemented and established. And that is done in a use it or lose it sort of fashion. The same with something called perineuronal nets, which is an actual encasing of the neuron saying, okay, no more changes in this neuron. This is how it's going to stay from now on.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a fascinating thing. So from an evolutionary perspective, it appears that the individual, the human, is quite vulnerable during that time. What do you think is sort of the evolutionary basis for this, Bia? It's an objective function with two different requirements. You need to collect label cases, as we say in artificial intelligence. You have to collect experiences, but you have to figure out how to not get killed by collecting experiences. So how did we get here from an evolutionary perspective? Do we know?
Well, there are a couple of thoughts when it comes to looking at it in that manner. Like I said before, it is adaptive. I mean, I often find myself in my talk saying adolescence is not an illness. It's a perfect time of development when, yes, there is a heightened risk, and in fact, mortality increases during that time. So you could say there is some sort of failure in that sense, but yes, that you are driven to new experiences because up to that point, you have been guided by the protection of your parents and your teachers, etc. But then when you reach adolescence, you're fully grown, you have this executive function, and now the brain says, go and get your driven experiences, right?
Yeah.
So another aspect of evolution that has come up is that in Western societies, there is evidence that adolescence is persisting into 25 years of age, approximately, right? Mm-hmm. Is not what we had thought about before. In fact, I was part of a report by the Institutes of Medicine and National Academy of Sciences, really bringing this to the fore. Hey, hello, from 18 to 25, we're not taking care of this period, and adulthood hasn't really been reached at that point. The evolutionary aspect of it is that, of course, it was controversial. There was media, and people are saying, oh, these irresponsible kids, we just let them be teenagers forever. But the truth is the longer you have to specialize, the better that specialization is going to occur. So what do you see at the end? You see people getting married later, committing to a professional trajectory later, but they're actually, they have a longer time to choose what they really are going to want to be. And that what really struck me is that once I was giving a talk at UNICEF and talking to somebody who, not a neuroscientist, was saying, oh, wow, that's so interesting, your talk, etc. And I forget what country they were reporting on, but they were telling me, in the country that I work in, girls as young as 10 or 11 married and already starting to form a family. And it occurred to me, adolescence is a luxury. It's a luxury that we have. So the longer that we have, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Yes, one can complain. I mean, I often think this protracted adolescence is getting a PhD, going to med school. You know what I mean? I often say that, you know what characterizes adulthood? When you're paying for your own iPhone bill.
No, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I want to put on one direction. It's not in the paper, but I want to get your perspective on this. So, is there some sort of societal evolution happening? So what I mean is that if we find a vulnerability for an individual in that time period, then if you have a society that recognizes it and controls it in some way, controlling is not the right term, but optimizes it, let's say, then you could get to some point. So again, rewinding time, there appears to be, was there a sort of a selection advantage to this idea? I mean, those who are really sort of brain dead between 16 and 22 would have gotten killed by animals, right? I mean, why do we have this feature?
Well, I mean, there are rodent studies that show that those adolescent pups that take the highest risk, which means they venture farther from the nest and the protection of their litter, if they don't get killed, are the ones that are going to have the best survival rate.
That's true, yeah.
So there is an aspect to, to advantages.
Yeah, so that makes sense. So in some sense, again, from a societal perspective, you wanted a percentage of the population to be like this, so they can push the envelope, they can take risks, and maybe a percentage of them will survive, but those who survive would actually survive into a better outcome for society in some ways.
Well, I mean, I do remember giving a talk once where somebody came up to me and said, is there something wrong with me? When I was a teenager, I never did anything crazy. And I had to really think about it and say, look, it's not really about being an adolescent and doing sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Really about new experiences. So it can be, right, all of a sudden you like sci-fi or you're become a history buff. That's within the context of where you had been developing up to that point. That's also sensation seeking. It's also called information seeking. So It's not just about risking your survival.
Yeah, I like that. Sensation seeking and information seeking. So again, going back to sort of a societal question, do you see is there a better design for society where you understand this and you necessarily plan for it so that you can get a better outcome for society in some way?
Yes, there are aspects that are informative. For example, I've spoken at one of the big adolescent medicine societies, and I did give feedback from clinicians saying, "Wow, I had never thought of this potential that adolescents might have access to executive function." And I had been talking down to them. So I'll give you an example, an adolescent with diabetes.
Yeah.
So this clinician, who reached out to me afterwards, saying our approach has been, get the family involved and not give a lot of responsibility to the adolescent. But now that you've told me that I can, now I can sit down alone. This is important, so there aren't distractions, so the adolescent can access their executive systems. Also thinking of the fact that reward, is also heightened, and it can be used, to help as well. And they said that now it's more effective for them because now the adolescent is taking care of themselves. And that leads to better health outcomes. So there are many ways that one could think about it: the juvenile justice system, the educational system, the parental system. And, I have gotten lots of feedback in that sense of like, wow, I never saw it that way. And maybe I will behave differently towards an adolescent to help them take advantage of that great period.
Yeah, so this is not in the paper, but I want to get your insight into this. So it seems to me, Bea, that there's some sort of societal overlay on this. I grew up in South India, and adolescent behavior in South India would be very different from New York today. And so can we abstract an individual's behavior away from sort of the environment, or is much more complex than that?
No, yeah, I don't think that we're at the level where we can really speak about the individual, certainly not by looking at their brain. But even, if you can recall back, I'll ask you, like I said before, would you agree that even if society was restrictive of adolescent risk-taking, that we're still sensation-seeking, information-seeking, novelty-seeking during that period within the confines of that society?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a beautiful question and possibly an experiment that if it's a universal feature, you would find people in that age group. Obviously, there are some constraints on them from a societal perspective, but I would imagine they would optimize within those constraints. That's my gut feel.
Yeah.
And we should find some sort of a universal behavior features, right, across the world, regardless of culture.
Yeah, and that's so, like I said, across species, it is very evident that there is sensation seeking peaking during the pubertal period. But by the way, I say puberty because there are hormones involved. And if you think of adolescence, I mean, it does have a purpose, which is reproduction. So, hormones come in and they, help the sexual, organisms or organs to mature so that there can be reproduction involved as well. So, there are some things that are going to be evident no matter where you go.
Yeah, so I saw in one of your papers that, and I think most people have noticed this, that girls mature a lot faster than boys, right?
That is correct, yeah.
And it's a systemic effect, as you say, puberty, hormones. So I think, do we have sufficient understanding how the whole mechanism happens there?
You mean sex differences?
Yeah.
Yeah, so one recurrent finding is that there are aspects of brain development that also are maturing earlier in females than males, particularly the maturation of the white matter. We wrote a paper time ago thinking about these sex differences. And what we looked at is, for example, stress reactivity. And this was led by Sarah Ordes, who was a grad student in my lab. And what she found is that across these stress psychology tests, which is, they give you impossible math problems, or they tell you have to, give a speech to a big audience, and it really increases stress. And what they found was that males' blood pressure, and this is across many different studies in different laboratories, males' blood pressure increased dramatically.
Yeah.
Females were very chill. But then after these tests, they would ask males, so what did you think of the test? And they were like, oh, no, it was fine. Even though their blood pressure had been really high, and females are like, I'm never doing this again. This is the most stressful thing ever. So we kind of put the pieces together, and we proposed that this earlier maturation of the female brain might give them access to emotional processing and the ability to integrate it with a parasympathetic system, and it might have an evolutionary, reason, and in the fact that back in the days, you're in the cave with your newborns and you have to form an attachment to stay in there and take care of them, while the males have to be distant so they can go and kill the lion and whatever and bring dinner back.
Right.
So, there are these different aspects to it.
Yeah, so I was stretching this a bit, Bia. So I wrote a book in 2009. It's called Flexibility, in which I argue that men should never be put into positions of managing complex systems like countries, multinationals, and so on. And what I argue is that the man's brain appears to be highly process-centric for evolutionary reasons, and very efficient given an objective function. But when you have a complex system to manage, like manage a country in the midst of a pandemic, as an example,
Exactly.
You don't do too well. It's sort of.
Yeah, I mean, for example, our tasks looking at cognitive control have not really shown sex differences.
Yeah. Okay.
But hormonally, we're starting to really look at these more, and some sex differences are starting to emerge, and there are things that we know. So, for example, depression is more predominant in females, and it emerges in adolescence. So a lot of these major psychiatric disorders are emerging during this transition of the adolescent period, and that's why I've been getting funding for a long time from the NIH, because they know something is occurring during this transition that tells us about different mental illnesses, but why different sexes are more amenable to one than the other.
Yeah. So again, from a societal perspective, though, you probably have the statistics on this. So when we look at suboptimum behavior, crime, other things, there is a concentration there, right?
Right. So yes, it is true that delinquency is peaking in adolescence to young adulthood, and then it decreases. But if you look at it, I mean, it's a small percentage. So
yeah,
yes, it is true that, like I said before, the sensation seeking with this, which is great, it comes in all flavors and so forth, can lead to risk-taking behavior. If what you're telling me is that because there is a small percentage that will reach delinquency, that we consider the whole developmental stage as an impairment, I would say no.
Yeah, I agree. But so you have another, very extensive research around this. Some Supreme Court decisions around bad behavior of juveniles and whether we can actually take the stage of their brain development as sort of a defense against that. So what is the status quo on that idea?
Well, I think what's very important, and I say this when I give this lecture to like people in law school, is that this is not saying that the crime that occurred, that they're not guilty for the crime that has occurred. And the cases that were up for the Supreme Court where some of them were very extreme crimes, like cold-blooded murder, etc. So it's not saying, oh, forgive them because they were adolescents. It really, and the reason I accepted this was because it was not asking for that. It was asking for life without parole. The extent of, so what you could say is, yes, what they did was wrong. What is the correct punishment when we take into consideration that this is a still not determined human being?
Yeah. I don't know if there has been any thinking around this, Bia. Just to ask you the question, if you believe that there's experimentation going on, there's risk-taking, there's sensation-seeking, do you think the parents could be held accountable?
No.
Okay.
I mean, part of being an adolescent is to be doing things independently from parents. Of course, parents play a very important role. I often find myself telling parents, you will have an argument with your teenager and it'll look like they're not listening to you. Don't give up. Keep talking because the brain is still processing. And it'll reach them. Just don't give up on them.
Yeah. So in a larger sense, what you're arguing, if I understand it, is that society has to really internalize there is a process going on in the human brain. And for a period of time, it appears highly vulnerable. And in a very advanced society, I would imagine we could take care of it. But increasingly, we are in an environment where we don't have those types of things anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's and I think that you've alluded to this. There is a line that one doesn't want to cross, which is controlling normative development.
Yeah.
I guess at some point, if we can really understand psychopathy, then that could be of importance. We are involved in an analysis where we're trying to understand brain and delinquency associations to see if there is some sort of if we can inform that association in a way that could help us understand predisposition. But even then, you don't want to label a young individual and pretty much make them go in that trajectory.
Yeah, so is there any data on cross-sectional differences across countries? Have you seen anything? I'm just wondering, between US, EU, and maybe Scandinavia, other developed countries, do we know there's any variation?
I haven't looked at it. I suspect it wouldn't be hard to look at, at what age crime is peaking, and I'm sure it's going to be very similar, that it is peaking around adolescence and young adulthood and things of that sort. I haven't done that analysis myself.
Yeah, that will be very interesting, because if you believe there's a societal influence on child development, it should show up in the data, I would think. So if there's a cultural factor on the problem, we should be able to tease that out from the data.
Yeah, but what I'm proposing is that there is something that's independent from culture and society.
Yeah.
Right? That it's more neurobiological and adaptive in nature. The puberty hits, and it is adaptive to have that sensation seeking that is occurring.
Yeah, so we can expect sort of the baseline to happen that way, but what I was wondering is there is sort of an overlay on top of that, whether it's family, immediate family, neighborhood, culture, society, country, whether it could have some mediating effect on that.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there are important environmental factors like social economic status and the ability to have resources, which increases stress, and not only is it affecting neurobiology during that time period, but also motivating this ability to have risk taking as well. So yes,
Yeah.
and you can see that crime this with populations that have more limited access to resources. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's a resource question too. We'll take a quick break, Bia. When we come back, we'll talk about your recent paper on the dopamine system.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.
So we're back, Bia. We're talking about cognitive control, how the brain develops from childhood to adulthood. And there is a phase of, as most parents know, a period of vulnerability for kids growing up. And it's a complex growing up process the brain has to go through. And we are getting increasingly more interesting data around this. Obviously, it has some implications for the juvenile criminal justice system that you have written about, Bia. I want to go to one of your recent papers, Maturation of the Human Striatal Dopamine System, revealed by PET and quantitative MRI. So you say in this, the development of the striatum dopamine, DA system through human adolescence, a time of increased sensation seeking and vulnerability to the emergence of psychopathology, has been difficult to study due to the pediatric restrictions on direct in vivo assessment of DA. So we have a lot of conjectures. Some of them have been already borne out by data, but we cannot really get very, very hard data on the longitudinal aspects of this, right? Is that the problem?
Well, what we're talking about there is that so DA refers to dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that is that underlies reward processing. And when, as we talked in the beginning, this heightened sensation seeking is very much associated with the striatal dopaminergic system, being that the striatum plays a key role in reward processing. And, we and others have found evidence of, greater reactivity in the striatal dopamine system using fMRI in the presence of rewards.
Where exactly be as a striatum in the brain? Approximately.
So, yeah, it's in the limbic system, so it's in the middle of the brain. Yeah. So it's in the basal ganglia, which is the part of the brain that determines action, that determines movement, that it's involved in Parkinson's and so forth. But it's also involved in learning, and in particular, reward processing. And all that reward processing is when the individual gets a surprise reward for doing something, that then it's reinforced and they do it again, and dopamine is released, and it's called a prediction error, and this is how we learn. But so dopamine is very complex. It has many different aspects to it, and the animal literature shows that these different aspects might be developing at different rates. Dopamine, for example, is increased when people do drugs and when you're super excited. So it's become famous because of that.
Okay.
So the question for us, there had always been an assumption that dopaminergic function must be increased during the adolescent period, because we know that behaviorally sensation seeking is increasing. We know from fMRI the ventral striatum activity is increased during this time. But we didn't know, and it's very difficult because the way to look in vivo, right, in a live human being, how dopamine is processing is by using positron emission tomography, which requires the injection of a very small amount of radioactivity, which is really the equivalent of a transcontinental. But rightly so.
It's still in a hospital setting. That's the issue, right?
Yeah, and we in this study we did do PET, but only on 18 to 30-year-olds, and we used a very special machine that's called a molecular MR machine. So this is an MRI machine, a 3T MRI machine that simultaneously also collects PET. So although we studied 12 to 30-year-olds, we did MRI on all of them, and with the adults, we also did PET. And the reason that we did this was to really start to look at what is going on with dopamine when you're younger. So the way that we did this, and I have to give credit to Bart Larson, who was a grad student in my lab now. He's a postdoc at UPenn, brilliant. And he came up with this idea that he saw in the literature, that the iron in the tissue of the brain, not the blood, in the tissue of the brain, has been studied in Parkinson's, restless leg syndrome, ADHD, a lot of conditions where dopamine is involved. He also found out that this tissue iron is very important for the production of dopamine, and that it can be imaged non-invasively with MRI. And in fact, there was a study that looked at learning based on the tissue iron in the brain. So, the first paper that he wrote, he used machine learning to predict the age of the individual based on tissue iron in the striatum. And he was very effective in doing that. So what we did here was, well, is it really related to dopamine? So we did we obtained quantitative measures of tissue iron in the brain, and particularly in the striatum, because that's where tissue iron is concentrated. And we also obtained PET in adults. And what we found was the following. We found, not surprisingly, that tissue iron accumulates with age. That is known. In the striatum, it starts to stabilize around the adolescent period. Now, when we looked at PET, so now we're talking only about 18 to 30-year-olds. And remember, I said adolescence is prolonged for a long time. What we found was that
some of us remain to be in that state forever.
Yeah, I know that's what people say. It can be more complex than that, but absolutely. So what we found is that our PET measure of dopamine availability was stable from 18 to 30, established. And that measure was very much associated with tissue iron. So that's great. So that's telling us two things. Dopamine availability may already be established by adolescents. And importantly, hey, we have a non-invasive measure of a very important aspect of dopamine, which is dopamine availability. We also did another PET scan in these adults, looking at how many D2, D3 receptors were in the striatum. And what we found there, which is a really impactful finding, was that there is a decrease in the density of D2, D3 receptors. Now that's big because, people usually think, oh, as you get older, you get more things. But in fact, this is more akin to the story I told you about synaptic pruning, but now at the receptor level. So when we take this together, what we propose is that during development, based on, your predisposition, your environment, etc., the brain is deciding how much dopamine you are going to have. That becomes established by adolescence. And at that point, and I want to reiterate, this is a proposal, right, based on these findings, that at that point, the brain might say, okay, This is how much dopamine you're going to have. Now go and optimize the number of D2, D3 receptors that you have, right? We want to be the most effective in being able to, process that information in an optimal manner. And that is what we're thinking that we see evidence for. And we've taken that even further in a paper that literally just came out this week in Progress in Neurobiology, where we looked at this tissue iron, and we found that these developmental changes in tissue iron also support decreases in how the striatum, right, the part for reward, is talking to prefrontal executive systems. And because that is decreasing with age, which we propose is reflecting the attenuation of the influence of reward on executive function. And this is mediated by this indirect measure of dopamine availability.
Yeah, this is so fascinating, Bia. So let me see if I understand this. So dopamine obviously is a mediator in many different functions. And if I understand this correctly, Bia, so as you age, sort of the communications between sort of the executive functions in the brain and sensation-seeking aspects of the brain, those get dampened in some ways?
Yes. So, we've seen that evidence for this in many different ways. So we see, for example, when you present a reward stimuli, that the reactivity in the striatum decreases with age. We've looked at functional connectivity between the ventral tegmental area, which is a part of the brain that produces dopamine, and the striatum also decreases during a rewarded state. It also decreases from, developmentally into adulthood. And now we have this finding of decreases in D2, D3 receptor densities also from adolescence to adulthood. So, and also we looked at white matter connectivity in the basal ganglia in convergence zones where limbic regions and executive regions exchange information. And we found that there was a shift from adolescence where there were more white matter connections that were predominating over the cognitive ones, and that flipped so that by adulthood, more cognitive connections were predominating over the affective ones. And then when we looked at what was underlying that, we found that in fact, the integrity of the white matter connections from cognitive regions were stable, just like our driven dual systems model would have predicted. But the ones coming from affective regions were decreasing their integrity. So again, attenuation of these affective systems.
Yeah, so it is true that if you don't use it, you will lose it.
Yeah, and what I always say is that the brain is not trying to be good or bad. It's what you're feeding it. If you're feeding that it's amygdala, which is a part of the brain that has a lot to do with fear and emotion and so forth, if the amygdala is predominating over prefrontal cortex, throughout development, in particular in adolescence, the brain is going to say, oh, we see that this is who you are. Let's really cement this and make it predominant. And boom, here you are, someone who has a risk for mood disorders and possibly psychosis, which is things that we have found as well.
Yeah, and Facebook users and democracy in more general has some implications.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I always see all these things as being more evolutionary. I always get asked that, oh, what's going on with all this iPhone news? Or I remember a long time ago, what's up with that hip hop music, And it's just, we adapt. We're plastic. We're humans.
Yeah, so I want to ask you in conclusion, I know that you are doing a lot of work in this area. This could go in a lot of different directions. It has implications for the criminal justice system, as one of your papers detailed. It even has implications for sort of policies for countries. So where do you think this will go? As you look forward 5-10 years, where do you think you'll focus on in terms of further fleshing this out?
Well, one long-term goal that we have is, this decades of understanding the neural basis of the development of cognitive control.
Yeah.
We would like to, and we're working on it, design a pediatric growth chart. When you bring your child and they're like, oh, their height is 70th percentile in the pediatric growth chart. We would like to have a cognitive pediatric growth chart. Because we know about the brain mechanisms and we know the cognition is so fragile when it comes to mental illness, to be able to track the individual. And if we see that they're starting to fall out of this pediatric growth chart, to come up with interventions that are just very much targeted to cognitive control, to bring them back up so that we can ameliorate the risk for having a poor trajectory, to better equip them. We don't have illusions that we're going to, stop the coming of a neurobiological predisposition, but that we could better enforce, because again, in a use it or lose it fashion, and better prepare the individual going forward.
Yeah. So very, very quickly, because do you think, well, I don't know if I asked this question before, do you think there is some sort of a therapeutic intervention that might be possible in the future?
Yes. Because again, use it or lose it. So one way of thinking about it is, if you're engaged in a certain activity, which is repeated and done, more often, then the brain is going to be exercising that, let's say in quotes, muscle, and it'll become more predominant.
Yeah.
And you can see that, in situations where you have trauma, where you have a lot of stress, it really does affect the neurobiological trajectory that happens. So yes, what those interventions are, I think a lot of people are working on it, and is to be set.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Bia. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Okay. No, it was great talking to you, Gil.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.